Hi, good morning, all friends. Well, I welcome you to the
Good morning, sir.
8th online session. Uh, in the previous class, in the previous lecture, we talked about the period of Victorianism or Victorian literature, the age of Victorian literature, the age of Victorianism. And we said that all these writers, we had first generation Victorian writers, second generation writers talking about uh, culture. So we said that all these so we had writers like Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, etc., Matthew Arnold, and the second generation like we had Tennyson, we had Alfred Tennyson, we had uh, the other famous poet called Robert Browning. Also, all these writers they belong to Victorian period, and culture for the first time was defined by this person, this poet called Matthew Arnold, and he said that what did we talked about Victorian compromise because basically we said that they were the men of religion. They were committed to their religion, but they compromised on the religious values, on the spiritual values, because they sold uh, their writings. They actually they their aim was to promote their writings, but they kind of, in order to sell their writings, they used religion. So kind of, and at the same time, we talked about because all these scientific developments were taking place. Darwin had come up with a theory called theory of evolution. Aldous Huxley had come up with this theory. The other person called the other scientist had William Harvey. So there was this kind of compromise when we talk about this age, and they kind of sold their religion, their spiritual values, and there, when it comes to poetry, when we talk about the poetry, the literature written, especially the poetry written in this particular age, we can see there is this the theme of loss, nostalgia, etc., and this pain of the loss or nostalgia. It becomes painful. It becomes more painful or agonizing in the poetry of Matthew Arnold, and he talks about culture. And he talks about culture for the first time. Somebody talking about culture, he says that culture and anarchy. He comes up with his book called Culture and Anarchy, and he also comes up with his. He defines poetry. He defines literature as the criticism of life. He talks about literature as criticism of life. So that was all about the Victorian period or Victorian age, where writers talked about you know uh, uh, religious. They were basically religious. They were basically spiritual, but they kind of sold those religious values. They attacked science in a way also, but they could not, their writings could not overshadow that, we can say. And so there was this compromise. It was an age of compromise. It was an age of, that's why there is something called as the age of compromise, and it was an age of reconciliation also. So that is what Victorian compromise is all about. So in today's lecture now, in today's class, or in today's lecture, we're going to talk about the modern period, the 20th century literature. Okay, and assignments. Somebody is asking me about assignments. I am not sure. I will talk about it later, maybe if we get time. Pooja, I will talk about it later. Don't worry. When it comes to now today in today's class, in today's lecture, we are going to talk about your unit number 5. Last unit is all about 20th century literature. So this is basically, I have already given you the dates for Victorian period. Victorian period marks from 1837 to 1895. So from 1895 onwards, we have something called as modernist movement or modern movement, or we can say the modern age. It starts from 1895, and there are some people, there are some critics who say that it actually the modern period starts from 1914, after 1914, when we have the First World War taking place. And but roughly speaking, we can say that it started from 1895, and it can be the modernist movement lasts up to 1945, which is the when the World War second ended. Okay, so you can write down the dates of modern age or modern literature or modern movement. It starts from 1895 to 1945. Okay, so when we talk about modernist movement or modern movement, the modern age, it was basically not a movement in itself. It was not. It was basically a collaboration. There were a set of. It was a group of movements. Taking place. It was a set of movements. It was a group of movements. For example, you had Surrealism, you had Cubism, you had Alticism, Vorticism, you had feminism. Also, all these expressionism, Surrealism. Okay, all these movements were taking place in England and other countries also. As such, there was no collaboration. It is no collaboration of writer. It was just a set of movements. It was not a collaborative movement. It was not, we can say it was not a movement in itself. There were set of movements, which we call the modernist age. So modern or contemporary age, we can say. So it was in the first time. It was the first time in 20th century, when the modernism was located. Modernism found its location. What is today's topic? Page number. Yeah, please go back to page number 359. We are talking about background to the 20th century literature, or 20th literature, 20th century literature. Okay, so background we are talking about. We are talking about the overview of the 20th century or modernist movement or modern literature. So modern, when we talk about the 20th century, so modernism has found its place. It found, it finds its location in 20th century. We have already talked about that. And in fact, there are so many events, a couple of events responsible for the modern age. For example, take the case of World War. First World War had taken place in 1914, and it had taken place between 1914 up to 1918. So it was a great event in the history. So we can say kind of a beginning was made which changed the world. So it was because of World War first, change had taken place. Beginning was made, and we could see the change in the world. And we have so many people now, very important people who kind of changed the course of the age, we can say. For example, we have Nietzsche, who was basically a German philosopher, talking about, he gave us a theory, he talked about an idea called the death of God. His philosophy was called as death of God, where he said that, in ancient times, there was a sort of continuity. It was a God's word. It was like, God used to supervise. God supervised us. He punished us. But he says that in this age, in 20th century, there is no God. So this world is a godless world. There is no presence of a God. There is no guiding force, and that's why he wrote a book uh, called Beyond Good and Evil. So he comes up with a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and it was later this critique. He came up, French philosopher and critic. He came up with this theory called death of an author. So he was basically inspired by Nietzsche, a German philosopher, who says that there is no God, there is no presence of God, because there is no continuity in this century. God is not supervising us. He does not overlook us. He's not supervising. So he says that there is no guiding force when we talk about the contemporary century, when we talk about the present century. So that is why he came up with a book called beyond good and evil. And he says that man basically has become an individual now, individual self. There's nobody who overlooks him. There's nobody who supervises him. There's nobody above, they who supervises him, who guides him. So basically, he wants to say that there is no God. We are living in the godless world. So on an analogy, death of God came, death of author, as I told you, that death of the author was an essay, a critical essay. It was it was published in 1968 by the French author called Roland Barthes. So Roland Barthes was a French critic, a French author who came up with his essay called Death of God, and death of an author who was inspired by Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a German philosopher. So basically in that essay, he says that every word is the structure of words. He basically talks about words, and it is the word which is basic. Okay, so he says that words have their own origin, words have their own history, and you have to look into them rather than the intention of the author. So he says he nullifies, he falsifies the intention of the author. He says that words have their own history, words have their own origin. So he says that Roland Barthes, who comes up with an essay called Death of an Author, he says that it is the word, words have their own history, they have their own origin. You have to really look into them, the intention rather than the intention of the author. That is not important. The intention of the author is not important. We called it, intentional fallacy. Intentional fallacy means the intention of the author, the intentions of the author can be falsified. Okay, so the order of the words give us intention, so the order, it is, so he says that it is basically the order of the words, the way the words in a text have been sequenced, have been put into order. So that, he says, is very, very important. So modern, we can say, when we talk about the term modern, it had a meaning which was general, because what was going on, but here it got fixed. Earlier, it had a general meaning, modern, the age of modernism or age of modern literature. But modernism became as important as the birth of Christ. Now it kind of, we can say, it got a fixed meaning. Before that, it had a generic meaning, it had a general meaning, but now it got its meaning fixed, because it became as important as the birth of Christ, because everything coming after will be called as postmodern. So we have anything which was the literature which is produced after World War II, that is 1945, is considered as postmodern. Now, before that, it is, from 1895 to 1945. These are the dates for modern period, the modernist movement or the modern literature. But and after post World War II, that is post 1945, we say that it is postmodern. We can call it postmodern. And before that, it was like pre-modern, before modern age. And as such, there was no movement when we talk about the age of modernism, the name modernism. There was no such movement as such.
The modern age period, sir?
The dates are 1895 to 1945. It
Okay, sir.
starts, yeah, roughly it starts from 1895 up to 1945. So after that, we call it postmodern age. So as such, there was no movement in the name of modernism. As I earlier told you that they were actually individual movements. For example, we had so many movements like Cubism, Vorticism, we had Surrealism, we had feminism, we had expressionism. All these feminism, Surrealism, expressionism, all these movements come together. These were the set of movements, and we call it the age of modern period or modernist movement or modern age. Okay, and the other important, so basically these were individual movements. Okay, so they were like 1 dozen, movements taking place in this period, and we call it modern. And the other event which took place other than World War First was Russian Revolution. World War First had taken place in 1914, and it lasted up to 1918. So between 1914 to 1918, World War First had was taking place, and it had changed the course of the time. It has changed the course of the world. And the other important event which took place was Russian Revolution. So Russian Revolution had taken place in 1917. It was called the People's Movement, which overthrew the government, and communists came, and it was communism is all about classless society where there is no discrimination in between different classes, and it is also called as October Revolution. October Revolution. So there was no high, no middle, and no class when we talk about this revolution called Russian Revolution. It had taken place in 1917. And the other important event, very important event, which had taken place in this period was the Wall Street crash. So what happened in Wall Street crash? And it took place in 1928. Wall Street is a place in New York, America. So it was of international magnitude. So the Western economy had collapsed. People had become starved. There were no jobs, nothing. So people were literally starving. So millions of millions had to migrate. So there was this complete starvation, the loss of jobs, everything had collapsed. So that is why Wall Street crashed. The Wall Street crash is name of a place in America. So the people had to migrate from Europe and America, and from they had to migrate from to other places. And it is also this period between 1929 to 1939. It's also called as the decade of depression. The decade of depression between 1929 to 1939. These 10 years, the decade. This is also called as the decade of depression. So it's kind of, you can say, the Marxism had taken place. Marxism in Anglo-American literature, socialism we could found in Anglo-American writers, and all these writers actually they got attracted to Marxism. So ideas against Marxism had failed. Okay, so all the writers of the world, they got attracted to Marxism, which has, which kind of had taken its roots, we can say. So Anglo-American literature had become Marxist in many ways. So it had really its impact, we can say, on literature. For example, take the case of, please mute yourselves. For example, take the case of Willie Loman in one of the novels. Willie Loman is a character in one of the novels, American novels called Death of a Salesman. The novelist is known as Arthur Miller, an American hero, and Hemingway also. For example, all these writers, they got kind of, they participated in war, in different wars, and World War First. All these people, all these writers like Hemingway, he got injured, in a war. Faulkner also. So many of them basically. So it really had impact on literature. So the disillusionment. So modern literature, the modern period is known as the age of disillusionment. The because people got disillusioned, with the Western civilization. They thought the Western civilization, they thought that it had failed them. Okay, so that is why it was a book produced by Spangler. Spangler is the other noted writer of this period, who came up with his book called who came up with this book. Now, there was this person called, this writer called Spangler, who came up with a book titled as Decline of the West. And this book became the kind of generic or basic for T.S. Eliot's. Now, T.S. Eliot belongs to this age, belongs to the modern age. You have a poem also written by T.S. Eliot, prescribed in your syllabus. In fact, two poems, The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock and The Hollow Man, 1925 by T.S. Eliot. And T.S. Eliot was inspired, we can say the Wasteland is actually based on this book called Decline of the West, because he talks about the age of disillusionment. He talks about the disillusioned man, he talks about the waste. He talks about the Western civilization, which had declined, we can say, which had failed, which had collapsed, we can say. So that is why he says that life has become a wasteland. There is no positivity. There is no. It has become. It is no more a heavenly, garden. There is no crop. It has become a wasteland now. Symbolically, that is literally, symbolically, there are no positive ideas grown in the land, because he thought that civilization, Western civilization, failed, and it had, because it got collapsed. It had got collapsed, and he says that it has now, life is a complete wasteland. Life is completely a wasteland, as there is no, it is not a heavenly garden anymore. So kind of, there was this sense of disillusionment, as I told you earlier. There was this sense of dislocation. Man had lost. There was this. He was completely lost. They thought. So the other. So we have all these writers, for example, they thought that since Western civilization has failed, we had these writers, for example, Gertrude Stein. He All these writers actually, they migrated to, they went to the other countries, Germany, Paris, France, etc. So sense of not belonging to anywhere. It was the themes. It was, we can say, the idea of the poem, the literature produced in this age, especially the wasteland. So non-identification of things with the surroundings. So there was a sense of dislocation. There was a sense of alienation. People thought that people, an individual writers had thought that people have become alienated, they have become dislocated, they have become kind of, we can say, alienated from their roots. So, for example, if you talk about the characters in the wasteland, he says that characters in the wasteland are rootless, you know, uh, and it is, for example, talk about the homeless character called Prufrock. Okay, he says that life has become a painful experience for him. That is why there is this anguish
Sir,
in,
once again repeat the name, no? Characters of the Wasteland.
yeah, characters of the wasteland have become rootless. There's a character called Alfred J. Prufrock. That is, you have a poem based on that character. The title of the poem is itself Alfred J. Prufrock. So he basically talks about the character. He says that about this particular character, he says that his life has become painful, and which was like a representative for the of the modern man. So we can say that now there was this anguish. Anguish is the key to modern literature. So the sense of disillusionment, the sense of dislocation was the fundamental reason. Okay, so all the sense of being another individual, all the subsidiary feelings, all the secondary feelings come from there. So life had become dislocated, life had become disillusioned, life had become dislocated, and life had become meaningless. So that is what actually this modern literature is all about. Modernism is all about. Okay, so life has now moved from external to internal. That's why ideas are philosophical, they are kind of psychological, and they kind of become irrelevant now. So when you have, because Nietzsche had come up with his philosophy saying that we are living in the godless world. So when you are living in, when you have a godless world, you don't know what is good and what is bad, what is uh, uh, what is good and what is bad. Okay, so feelings of getting suffocated and choked. So it was like a split life, decomposed, as Proof says, split into 1,000 dots. Split into 1,000 dots. So that is really the representative line, we can say, on the part of Proof. He says that life has split into 1,000 dots, into 1,000 spots on a screen. In a way, he says that it has completely decomposed. It has completely dislocated. It has lost its location. It has, life has become meaningless, a kind of a life where we do not know where to go. So we do not know where to go. We are not sure where to go, how to find a way. So in a way, it has become decomposed. It has ceased to exist. Okay. So wilderness, alien land, all these alienation, dislocation, sense of belonging to sense of belonging to nowhere. These are some recurrent themes, we can say, some of the important themes in modernist literature, or modernist movement. So later, for example, we had some psychologists, we have scientists. They said that memory. They talked about memory because later on we had some psychological novels produced in the age. For example, this Henry James comes up with his novel called The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, where, in fact, D.H. Lawrence has, to his credit, so many novelists, but the novel called Sons and Lovers, which is prescribed in your textbook, is a psychological novel. You can find psychological element because there was a psychologist, a psychoanalyst who had come up with his book called Principles of Psychology, and all these writers, Virginia Woolf, who wrote Rome of Unknown, Jacob's Room is a psychological novel, and D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers is also a psychological novel. The Portrait of Artist as a Young Man is a psychological novel, and all these novels are psychological. We could find elements of psychology, and in this particular age, because this writer had written a book. He had come up with this book called Principles of Psychology, and all these writers were influenced by his book. William James was a writer who came up with the book called Principles of Psychology. Okay, and it was his brother Henry James who came up with a novel. Who became a famous novelist later. He came up with one of the famous novels he has written is A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which is which is considered as a psychological novel. For example, the psychological novels like To the Lighthouse. To the Lighthouse is also one of the novels by Virginia Woolf, uh, a novelist of the 20th century. Mr. Dalloway's House, for example, was a novel by it was by probably by Dalloway's House was by Jane Austen, I think. Not sure about it. Please Google it. So they say all these writers believe that there should not be that. They did not believe in the traditional value, traditional narrative. They were against that. They said that there should be something new. They said that they thought that it has to be different from the previous age. The narrative has to be different. Uh, and so they said that your mind can travel to past, future, and be present also. So kind of simultaneity of past, present, and future. It was a discovery for the modern discovery of modernist thinkers, modernist philosophers. And Henry James gave a new way of presenting the story. He had studied his brother's book, as I already told you, and he had learned that life is full about internal rather than external. So new kind of fiction, new kind of novelists was produced in this particular age, where writers said that time is not linear. Time has its own circles. Time has its own kind of we can say wavelengths. So it's a world of its own, functioning upon its own principles. Okay, so James Joyce comes up with a novel called Ulysses. James Joyce, who is known for writing psychological novels, he comes up with a novel called Ulysses, the portrait of an artist as a young man. It was published in 1970, and things had drastically changed, during the modernist movement. So calling this period modern is kind of problematic also, because we have no more a workable label for all these 50 years, that is 1895 to 1940 45. But all that follows is, as I earlier told you, that all that follows is post-modern, and all that precedes is pre-modern. So we can say pre-modern, modern, and post-modern. And now, when we talk about this age, the period, especially the period between 1895 to 1945, we have two people who are considered very important when it comes to modern literature. There are other people also, but they came later. I mean, all these people were, Virginia Woolf, Austen, other people, Henry James, they came after 1945. But during the modernist period, we had two people who really kind of spearheaded, we can say, who guided this movement. We will talk about it. Okay. Any questions? Anything so far? Am I audible to you? Is everybody listening to me properly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Give me a second.
Sir, will you explain about what is mean by feminism?
So, when we talk about this period called the modern age or the modern movement, we had two people here who were considered as very important when it comes to the literature of the age, when it comes to the literature of the age. So, modernist movement, it was spearheaded, we can say. It was kind of guided by, or it was spearheaded by Eliot and Pound. T.S. Eliot was a poet, and Ezra Pound was, they were both poets of the period, and they were basically Americans who had come to England. In fact, the movement was initiated by other people, other practitioners, but and they, they, all these people, they were living in other countries, and because they thought that their thought was radical, and the movement was spearheaded by Eliot and Pound, but this movement was initiated by other people, by other poets or other practitioners who were living in other countries, because they thought their ideology, their thoughts are radical, and they won't be allowed to live in their country. And so modernists like T.S. Eliot and internationalists like, for example, who had other people who lived in other countries, they would hate to be associated with any nation, okay, with any country. So we had now two important people here found, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is a famous, of course, representative poet of the age who, there are two poems uh, in your syllabus, T.S. Eliot's two poems, and he is known for the epic poem called The Wasteland. The Wasteland. And we talk about T.S. Eliot, but he has other poems to his credit also. Two poems are already prescribed in your syllabus. So Ezra Pound, when we talk about this first poet called Ezra Pound, he was a kind of self-opinionated. He was arrogant. He was and kind of, he was so arrogant in nature, and he thought that his country, America, is barbarous, and that is why he thought that he should shift to Paris, which was which was thought to be the center of arts. At that point of time, France was considered the center for arts, like literature, painting, sculpture, music. So he thought that he was basically an American, but he had to leave his country because he thought that his country has no civilization of its own. It was a barbarous country. He was, that kind of person. He was so arrogant, so kind of overconfident about himself. But he was a literary genius because he had written those cantos, those poems, and he thought that he had to shift to Paris. He shifted to France because it was a center of arts at that point of time. T.S. Eliot, when we talk about T.S. Eliot, he had to travel to England. He did not belong to, he was not a British by birth. He was an American by birth, and he had to travel. He had to migrate. He had to shift to England, which was not his birth country, as he thought that his own country is not really cultured enough of what he really wanted to do. So he thought that his country is not, kind of cultured. Then, his work is not appreciated. His work is not properly appreciated in his own country. So he had to shift to to the country called England. He had to shift to England. So basically, both these writers are not British by birth. Ezra Pound had to shift to Paris to France, and this man called T.S. Eliot had to shift to England in order to, kind of, do well in his profession, because he thought that America is not going, his own country, America is not going to respect his work. They are not going to appreciate his work. Okay, so Pound says that civilization, America has no civilization, in his own. And there was this new movement in poetry. They had started this new movement in the field of poetry, and this group was called as Imagists. The Imagists. So there was this group called Imagism. The movement was that of Imagism. It was a philosophy of art. It was, the first poet, so they initiated this movement called Imagism, or, Imagistas. These couple of writers, this group of writers was called as Imagist writers, or the Imagistas. So the first poet among them was T.E. Hume, Hume. So he basically wrote 4 poems, but it was because of those 4 poems he kind of brought a revolution. He revolutionized the world of literature with those 4 poems, and that is why he is regarded as the pioneer, as the beginner of Imagism. Okay, now what is Imagism? We will talk about that. So he sort of writes a kind of, he sets the tone, we can say, for this movement called imagism. So this was also one of the yeah. What is somebody is yeah? I will talk about that later. Okay, so these people, especially this person, especially this poet T.E. he wrote 4 poems, and that revolutionized the world of literature. That set the tone for this movement called the movement called imagism. And he sort of writes a manifesto, we can say, to this movement called imagism. So they had their own principles. They said something like they come up with their own thoughts, they come up with their own ideas. What should the modern literature look like? What should be the components of modern poetry? So their first principle is uh, they say that their first principle says that things should be directly said. So the treatment of the subject matter should be direct. Okay, the treatment things should be said directly. That was their first principle. Okay, and second was one should not, or you should poet should not use a word of your own. So they said that you are not allowed to use a word, use a term of your own. There should not be the language should not be written in the ornamental style, ornamented language. Shouldn't there should not be the place for language or ornamentation. Okay, kind of, he talks about the superfluity, no superfluous, no extra word or no extra term should be used. The narrative should be the direct narrative should be direct. That's the first principle they say. And the word no superfluous words, no extra words should be used. That is second. And they talked about rhythm also. When it comes to poetry, when we talk about the poetry, it should be both, not about poetry, both prose and poetry. There should be a rhythm. So they focused on the rhythm also. So the musical phrase should be written in the rhythmical manner. So it should have its own music, we can say. So the question about nomenclature, why did they call it imagism? Because their belief was that whatever one has to say, whatever one has to convey, should be said through images, should be said through symbols. That is why they call it a live image. They said that whatever you have to say through your poetry and prose, it should be said, it should be conveyed, it should be directed through symbols and images. That is why the word imagism, or the term images. So they say they focused on image. They said that image should speak to you. The live image should speak to you as the experience of life. So they said that nothing abstract you should talk about. There should be no space of abstraction. There should be no place for abstract ideas or abstract, things. So you should speak through symbols. You should speak through images. Okay, so that is what imagism was all about. And we had the other one of the imagists who comes up with a book. There were three people. T. Hume, the other poet was Harriet Monroe. She was a female writer, female poet. And of course, Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is also considered to be an imagist. Okay, so Harriet Monroe, who comes up with a book called Poetry. So poetry is basically a collection of the poetry of T.E. Hume. So she kind of composes his poetry. So a new poet to promote the imagist. She wrote in the particular style of imagist. So these were actually, Harriet Monroe, one of the imagists who comes up with his collection of poetry, with a collection of these 4 poems by T.E. Hume, and she kind of composes them. She comes up with a collection of 4 poems. She published the complete poetry of T. Hume under the title Poetry, and by others. So in that composition, in that collection, there were some poems 4 poems written by T. Hume, who was the beginner, the initiator, or the pioneer of imagism. And then the other, for example, Emmy Lowell. Emmy Lowell, T. Harriet Monroe, and T. Hume. These are some of the imagists. And last of all comes Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, as I already told you, he was like an, he was like an authoritative figure. He was like an authoritative literarian. When we talk about the modern age, he was considered as an authority of literature at that, in this particular period, and he was a real leader when we talk about the modern age, especially the imagists. Okay, and and basically he was American by birth, and he was the most local of all the imagists. You had Harriet Monroe, you had T.E. Hume, you had Emmy Lowell, etc. Okay, so all these writers, imagists, they were basically anti-Renaissance, and they thought that Renaissance had disrupted life. They had destroyed the Christian belief or Christian tradition, or they had destroyed. They thought that their belief was that Renaissance had destroyed the European civilization. It had destroyed the Christian. It had disrupted. It had disturbed the Christian faith, we can say. So, in the name of modernism, actually, they was I audible to you before?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So I was talking about this group of writers called imagists like T. Hume, uh, and Emmy Lowell, and this poet called Ezra Pound. So Ezra Pound is also one of the imagists, and Henry Monroe, I was talking to you that she comes up with a collection of poetry called, she titles it poetry, and in that particular collection we could found that there are 4 poems of T. Hume and by other writers, and some poems by other writers also. And they said that basically Ezra Pound was a real leader who was an American by birth, and he was the most vocal of all. And these writers, all these writers, these imagists especially, they were anti-Renaissance. They said that because they thought that Renaissance had disrupted, it had destroyed the Christian faith, the Christian tradition, and it had also destroyed, and they also believed that it had also destroyed the European civilization. Also, in the real sense, in the name of modernism, in the real sense of modernism, in the real sense, they were not basically modernists, as the term modernism goes. Because in the name of modernism, they were promoting their own religion. They were promoting Orthodox Christianity. Okay, so in the name of modernism, they were kind of, we can say, sugarcoating modernism, and they handed over modernism to the people, because they were talking about medieval ages. They were talking about they focused on Renaissance literature. They focused on they were anti-Renaissance. They focused on medieval literature. Okay, so basically they were sugarcoating it. They were not modern in the real sense, because all these people, especially Ezra Pound, who was the leader of this movement, he was anti, because modernism, when you talk about modernism or modern literature, modernism especially, it stands for democracy, it stands for liberty, equality, it stands for there should be place of science. Okay, but these people did not believe that, especially Ezra Pound. He was so kind of arrogant, he was authoritative, he was overconfident. In the previous class also, I am reminded of one of the anecdotes. Somebody talked about, Sarmaji talked about W.B. Yeats, who was a great poet and Irish basically. He comes up once up, he comes to know that this person, Ezra Pound, had come to England, and he was already there, W.B. Yeats, and he thought to visit him. He said that let me pay a visit to Ezra Pound. And he handed over his collection of poetry to him. And this man, being so arrogant and very overconfident about himself, he said, "No, leave this. This is rubbish." And that is how he was, Ezra Pound. And in the name of modernism, I was talking to you that in the name of modernism, they actually sugar-coated modernism because these people were they were basically anti-modernism because they were anti-democracy, they were anti-science, and they basically sugar-coated modernism. In the name of, they actually, we can say, sold medievalism. They sugar-coated modernism. They were sugarcoating medievalism, and they handed over it to the people as modernism. So progress we had. So for example, progressive writers, so many writers, they who fought in World War First and World War Second, and they got some of the writers got injured, and even some got killed also. For example, among injured was Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was a novelist who got injured in World War First. And the Pound's policy was, it was displaced. He was on the side of anti-democratic forces, as I already told you. Hitler was at that point of time, and he was friends with Hitler also. So he is known as the literary Hitler. He was a Hitler in the world of literature. Ezra Pound, when we talk about Ezra Pound, the Americans had arrested him after World War II. Ezra Pound was arrested by Americans after World War II, and fellow writers, and his fellow writers actually rescued him. He was jailed, he was arrested. They tried to arrest him, but he was rescued by his friends, by his fellow writers, fellow writers. So progressive writers like, for example, you had Hemingway, you had Frost, Robert Frost, an American poet. They got together to rescue this person, this writer, this literary giant called Ezra Pound, and he was taken to asylum, lunatic asylum later. But it was, so it is actually not, when we talk about the representative poet, the representative figure of modernism or modern age, it was T.S. Eliot, who proved to be the greatest poet. So it was basically T.S. Eliot who proved to be the greatest poet of the modern age. He made it because it was because of him, it was made popular. And these poets, by choice, by conviction, they were actually technicians. They thought that romantic poetry was, they were against romantic poetry. They were against Renaissance. They thought that no, it is not, poetry is not about personal satisfaction, because Wordsworth had come up with a definition which says that poetry is the overflow of spontaneous emotions. He said that he had talked about spontaneity of emotions, his emotions. They said that no, your emotions does not matter. They say that they come up with a view saying that what about the emotion of the readers? You have to take care of that also. Okay, that has to be taken into consideration also. That has to be taken into mind also. So spontaneity, you are talking about your emotions, that is not going to work. So you have to really take care of the emotions of other people also, your readers also. Okay, in a way, they kind of, we can say they came up with their own criticism. Okay, so there are these people actually, Eliot and Pound, they actually focused on the technical aspects of poetry. For example, they said that form is not important. The style is not important. They focused on the meter. Meter is also important. They said that music, meter, rhythm, images, as they were called as images, symbols, they said that the form and style is not going to be sufficient. They are not merely important. There are other things, there are other aspects also which are important, which are equally important. So in a way, they were technicians because they focused on the technical aspects of poetry. They focused on the technical aspects of literature. So they deliberately, they consciously learned it and they mastered it. So they were very conscious about it. They were very kind of conscious about it. That's why the new movement was being launched, and the poetry they were writing was very different from the traditional, because they believed, and their main focus was, they said that they believed that the poetry written in the 20th century should be different from the previous one, because they said that they believed that no traditional themes, styles, form, content should be followed. They said that it should be new and different. That was their focus, new and different. They said that, our people are fighting in wars, writers are getting injured, there are writers who have got killed also. So why to talk about all those things, where, those soft things which romantic writers talked about, wrote about, isn't it? So they said that no, our poetry shouldn't be soft. It has to be hard, because we are living in the hard times, because we have already faced World War First, and later on World War Second also took place. So, and these are, we had, somebody was talking about post-war fiction. So post-war fiction is all about fiction which was produced after after these wars took place, isn't it? So we had poetry, we had novels being produced, the literature being produced after these wars. So they basically, their argument is that no, the poetry, the literature should be written, it should be written with a different style, with different themes, different, different content has to be produced. So especially they talked about poetry. They said that no, poetry has to be new. It has to be different. And this poet, this literary figure, this person called Ezra Pound, he says that poetry should be made difficult. It should not be easy to understand. It should make it difficult, was his slogan actually. Make it new and make it difficult was his slogan. And overall, they said that the focus was that they said that no, make literature hard, make literature difficult, make literature tough, and make it new also. Okay, so that was the story of the 20th century. Okay, so kind of we can say, and the physical, the individual. When we talk about individual in the modern age, we talks about individualism, because say that individual has become a separate being. He has lost his location. He is a dislocated man. He is a disillusioned man, we can say. So all these are some of the themes of modern literature, we can say. So basically now they focus on the literature produced in 20th century focuses on individual man, individual in the modern age. They say that individual has become an entity, a anonymous person, anonymity they talk about. So so he is like a crowd among the crowds. Okay, so no one knows about himself or herself. No one knows about his location, about his whereabouts. So kind of we can say extreme form of individualism is key to modernism. Modernism, not as such as the term goes, modernist, because all these people, unfortunately, I don't understand. I mean, all these writers who are representing modern age are not modern in themselves, because they are anti-democracy, they are anti-science, isn't it? So extreme, in a sense, also modernism means that it focused on the extreme form of individualism, and it was key to modernism. Okay, that every individual is different. That what was the key to modernism? That it says, modernism says that every individual is different. Every individual is what? Different. That is why we had a novel called The Invisible Man. Ralph Waldo Emerson, comes up with that poem. Sorry, The Invisible Man, isn't? He talks about man. He talks about the invisibility of man. He talks about the dislocation of man, the disorientation of man, the we can say the whereabouts of man. So all these, this goes into modern literature or modern, modern age or modernist movement. Okay. So modern age, as we say that modern age, as T.S. Eliot says that it has become a wasteland where there's no space for positive ideas. There's no space for positive thinking. Okay. So with that, I wind up with my class. I wind up my class, my lecture. Any questions? Somebody was talking about, yeah. 1 second, I will go back to those questions in the chat box. I think I have answered your question. MS, important questions. I have already given you the important units.
Yes, sir.
Topics. Important topics cannot be given. I'm not sure about that. You must go through the previous papers, but I have given you some important units. Shall I repeat it? Block 1, unit number 2nd and 3rd. Go through these units from examination point of view. Then block 2nd is unit 8, unit 9, and unit 10. Okay. Then go to block 3rd, unit 12, 13, 14. That is block 3 for you. Then go to next is block 4, unit 17, 18, 19, 20. And block 5 is unit number 22, 23, and 25. Now, for example, you have this unit called Waiting for Godot. Waiting for Godot is by Samuel Beckett. It also talks about the absurdity of life. Kind of, these writers came later. They are like the writers came after 1945. We're talking about the modernist movement in general. If you have any questions, anything, yeah. Some MS is saying that today is last class. Okay, yeah, today is of course last session, but last but not the least.
Sir, please can you repeat once units?
Sarma is there? Mildred, I cannot
yes,
see
sir.
you today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. I am here.
You are
Yes,
silently
Listening,
not
sir.
saying anything, and
Therefore,
I thought you were not here. I couldn't
I am
see
here,
you.
sir.
Anyway.
And the important topics you have mentioned, sir. Unit 4, sonnets, Shakespeare, that is missing. Just that may be a miss from you.
Yes, that is important, but I'm not the authority actually. That is out of my knowledge, but that cannot be believed. I'm giving you out of that is some guess unit is. Actually, you have to go through every unit. From every unit, questions can be asked. In fact, whatever is there in your syllabus is important, isn't it? So yes, you can count that unit also sonnets, because Shakespeare and sonnets question will be asked. And I could say this in backlog examination, which was conducted some 2 months ago, 2-3 months. This question on this poem was asked: "Love Song of Albert J. Woodford" by T.S. Eliot. There was a question being asked on that, based on that unit 24.
Okay, so
Yes. Any questions? Anything you want to say? Anything
Yes,
out
sir.
of your understanding? Yeah, please go ahead.
According to the topic, we can write with our own language.
Yeah, you have to. It is always better to write in your. Of course, you're not going to mug up things. At this stage of time, I don't think that is possible. If you Go through your textbook. This textbook, the study material which has been prepared by the university is the best on earth. And maybe sometimes you can find not enough content sometimes on a particular topic, but this has been this is by best man. This material, the study material has been prepared by by different people, by best people. So I think this is the best study material you can go through. I don't think you have to go through other those guides or other. Sometimes you can Google also if you find if you do not find enough content. Sometimes that you can always do. But you go through your topics, your units, and then write in your own language. That is always appreciated, I think. And that is the best way, to do it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, will you be there in the exam time in the study center point of view? Will you be available there?
No. I won't be there. I mean, there are other people who will be there. I won't be there. I don't think I won't be there.
Have a nice day, sir.
Thank you.
Shall we leave the class?
You can. Time is over. Okay. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, sir.
All my students, sir.
Excuse me,
Yes.
sir.
Yes, please.
Advance happy Ramzan, sir.
Thank you so much. Same to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Good,
sir.
Hope your
good.
fasting is going on, sir.
Yes, it's going on. Let's start. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you, sir.
Thank you for joining this online session. Thank you. Take care.
We'll meet you.
And enjoy your other classes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, sir, and happy Ramzan, sir, in advance.
Thank you so much.
Meet
Thank you,
next
sir.
year, sir.